Chapter 12 deals with something called XML, which stands for Extensible Markup Language. And some of you have had the Internet Programming class, and in that class one of the things we talk about is HTML, which is an abbreviation for Hypertext Markup Language. So XML is a markup language, HTML is a markup language, and hypertext is text that links to other documents, which is what you see on the web all the time. You've got hyperlinks. And a markup language is basically a grammar or some rules for embedding information in a document about either the structure of the document or the format of the document or maybe both. And you put those things in with what are called tags. And they are meant to indicate the structure of the text. Tags usually come in pairs. There's an opening tag and a closing tag. And tags have names and attributes. Okay, so the original motivation for HTML was to exchange data on the internet. And the original version of HTML, and actually now we're kind of going back to this, described only the logical structure of documents. And so in the beginning, they didn't really care about making documents pretty. They cared about the structure. So this was a title, this was a heading, this was a paragraph, this was a table, stuff like that. They didn't really deal much with things like fonts or colors or those kinds of things. The history of HTML has involved adding more and more features to HTML that are not directly related to the structure, but are more related to the appearance of the document. And over the first 4 versions, things kind of kept going further and further in that direction. Then we got to HTML5, and they decided to back off of that and separate the structure of the document from the format of the document. And HTML5 now emphasizes the structure, or the logical structure, as it says in the notes here, of the document. There is a link in our notes to a really interesting article. It's not a real short article, but it's a pretty interesting article. This goes back to 1945, the end of World War II, and that would be about 75 years ago. The first computer was invented around this time. A guy named Vannevar Bush wrote an article where he conceived of something like today's hypertext, like we have on the internet. He couldn't possibly conceive of the internet or the World Wide Web as it exists today. So his interpretation of hypertext is based on the technology that they had back in 1945, but it's a fascinating article. So HTML, an advantage of HTML is that it is readable by people. Okay, so what I'm saying there is it's a text file. If you've ever accidentally tried to open up a Word document or an Excel document in something like Notepad, for example, you'll see that what's there is basically, it looks like junk. And that's because it's a binary file. The contents are out there in binary, so if an integer is stored out there, like number 1, 2, 3, it's not stored as the character 1, the character 2, and the character 3. It's stored as the binary representation of the number 123. And that looks completely different. And when you try to convert that into ASCII characters and display it in a program like Notepad, what you're going to get is something that just looks like junk. Okay. I'm not going to do this right now, but I would encourage you to try it out. Create a Word document that only has, about 10 letters in it. Hello is 5, world is 5, and comma, space, and exclamation. So we've got 13 characters there. Store it or save it as a DOC file. Save it as a DOCX file. Save it as an HTML file. Save it as an MHT file, which is a Microsoft format of HTML. I think Microsoft might be the only one that uses that format. Save it as PDF. Save it as text. You've got all those options that are right there in Word. You can save the same document, same content, hello world, And it looks like we got 7 different formats here. And if you go into Word and take a look at all the options, you've got a whole lot more than 7. So I did this, and this column over here tells how many characters these 13 bytes actually took up when I stored them out on a disk. So my 13 characters got translated into over 26,000 characters when stored in Word's original format. 13 or 11,000 in succeeding versions of Word. And HTML is in the same ballpark. Microsoft's MHT format is the biggest one so far, and then PDF is huge, 144,000 bytes. But if you save it as a text file, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about these markup languages, they store everything as text files. And it's 15 bytes. And you're probably wondering where the extra 2 bytes come from. The extra 2 bytes are an end of file marker. There has to be a special mark on the end so that when you're reading the document, you know that you're at the end of the file. With all these other formats here, you've got information like, the size of the page that the document's going to be printed on, the font that's being used, the colors that are being used, the margins that are being used, printer it's being sent to, all kinds of stuff. And even with all the things I've mentioned, it's still hard to fathom that you would need that many bytes to store an 11-character document, but apparently you do. So compact files are good. They don't take up as much space on your hard drive. It doesn't take them as long to transmit them from one location to another over the internet. And if they're plain old text files, you can edit them with a simple plain old text editor like Notepad. Some other text editors that you are familiar with in Visual Studio, it's got its own text editor as part of the integrated development environment for Visual Studio. And there are a number of other text editors that are out there. Basically, when you hear text editor, you kind of think programmer's editor because they're used to create data. They're not used to make text look pretty. Okay, originally we had tags that described the logical structure of a document, and here are some simple examples. They had a number of different options for headers, for headings, and from H1 to H6. And so H1 would be like a title for the whole document. Then if you had your document subdivided, that'd be H2s. And if they were subdivided, H3, and so on down to 6 levels. EM was for emphasizing text. UL was for an unordered list, which would basically appear as a bulleted list when you displayed it. And it wasn't long before other users wanted to get more out of HTML than the original intent. And so they wanted to be able to do things like controlling the font name and the font size and color and indentation and style and all kinds of things like that. And it kept getting more and more bloated over time. Most HTML documents are not valid in the sense that they're syntactically perfect because the authors are careless. And the way that they are typically validated is by viewing them in a browser, which means you may view a document in one browser and look one way, and it may look a different way in another browser, although it would probably look similar. But browsers, they don't show up an error message on the screen if you browse to a web page that has some kind of error in the HTML. They just ignore the error and try to proceed as best as they can. And usually what you end up with looks pretty good. If there's some serious mistakes in it, then you will notice it by the fact that the document just doesn't look right. So XML is an extensible markup language, and basically what you get with XML is you get the ability to define your own tags. If you learn HTML, there is a set number of specific tags that you have to learn in order to learn HTML. With XML, there is no fixed collection of tags. You make up the tags to meet whatever your specific needs are. So there are some rules for how you create these tags. And XML is not considered a replacement for HTML. Its use is completely different. Most of what XML is used for is taking structured document making it available to another application, sending it out over the internet to somebody else, and if it is structured, then they can read the document on the other end. Okay, so let's stop this video here, and in the next video we'll take a look at comparison between HTML and XML.